But that's the road. After the talk, we're going to have a live demonstration, kind of a walk through the workflow. And we also have room for 4 or 5 folks to do a live hands-on demo out about the Rap7 booth. So we have a bunch of the Rap7 team. We're out there hanging out. The metasploit development team are here. And happy to walk you through actually owning a bunch of targets and playing with the product. So if you have any questions, feel free to yell at me anytime. I'm going to get through probably the first chunk of this in about 10 minutes. And then we'll go into kind of the nitty-gritty details. I'm not going to address the open source versus commercial or the really detailed points of 3.4.0. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. A lot of that's already available on the blog, and the community FAQ and some other items are already posted. So if you're looking for more of a detailed explanation about how this product ties into the open source metasploit framework and how the commercial versus open source split works, look at the blog post, look at the community fact. Hopefully it's pretty clear how we're doing this, why I think this is going to be a model that'll work for everybody. So to get started. The agenda. First thing we do is talk about the Metasploit project itself, kind of the state of it since the acquisition, what we've been doing, our growth, some kind of highlights since October. Then we're talking about Metasploit Express, which is the first commercial product we announced today. Do a quick demo of Metasploit Express from top-down workflow demo. Of course, it's a live demo with a machine running like 15 VMs on it, so things could crash, go horribly wrong. In that case, we've got screenshots. We've got live demos outside that should work a little better. And finally, a comparison sheet of like Metasploit open source versus Metasploit Express. A comparison sheet of Metasploit Express versus Metasploit free version to give you an idea of kind of how those products align and what things they do, what things don't do relative to each other. To start, first off, the Rap7 team is now 6 full-time people. We've got 5 of them here today. One of them is a holdout and has some kids at home he couldn't leave behind, so we understand why he's not here. But we've got 6 full-time folks working just on the Metasploit project, entirely new department within Rap7. So there's no kind of, we're not pulling from engineering team, we're not pulling from QA, we actually have our own department, our own development team. Most of these folks, 5 of them now, live in Austin, Texas, and that's where the team is currently located. The headquarters, of course, is here in Boston, and our engineering shop is in LA, but the Metasploit development team is mostly centered around Austin, Texas. We have 3 remote contractor teams, so these are the folks who help us out with things like exploit development, meterpreter development, payloads. We're actually paying money for folks to work directly on the open source source stream with no correlation, no licensing, no funny business of how we pay those folks or where the end result is. So you look at things like a lot of the meterpreter changes, a lot of the payload changes, we're actually paying contractors to work on open source code full time as part of just what we do at Rap7. And of course we have support from every other team at Rap7 as well, from sales, pre-sales, support, community, engineering, everybody involved with Rap7 is helping out with the Metasploit project in some way or another. A lot of times we'll have folks who are on the Nexpo side actually recommending Metasploit as the test product to validate the exploits being used by the Nexpo scanner. So we think it's a really good fit within Rap7, and the whole company's kind of pulling together to make sure this product succeeds, and we don't do anything just terrible and sell our soul or anything like that. Like, the whole company really is on board with the vision that we have. On the community development side, things are a little bit different. What we found is after the acquisition, we had a couple of long-term contributors who were very, F the man types who decided not to contribute afterwards. And we're like, that's your decision. We don't understand why you're doing it because the company model hasn't really changed. Instead of being Metasploit LLC, it was Rap7 LLC. And that's the only real difference after the acquisition. That and the funding and everything else behind it. We had a couple of folks who walked away after that. What surprised us, though, is we actually had twice as many people come back immediately afterwards saying, now that you're part of a big company, I can contribute. Like, why did this matter before? Like, we thought we were okay before, but no, apparently being part of Rap7 gave these folks a reason to contribute code. And I felt better about long-term commitments and long-term project stability. So we actually, we've been a net win overall, and we've actually been getting a lot more contributors the last couple of we're really pushing the project forward. Metasploit has always been evolving based on what customers and users and actual pen testers, people in the field want. I mean, we get a request for a new feature, we generally get it in within a day or two. That's just how we work, and that's what we do and why we do it. So we've been pretty happy with the response so far, and we're happy that we have 10 external contributors who are pretty frequently adding new features. We've been doing tons of third-party integration. I mean, while some commercial products have integrated us, we've actually been doing a lot of real integration with other products, even ones that compete with Rap7's main business, which is Nexpos. And that's just how the product operates. We're not going to blacklist any particular commercial product because of how they stand in terms of the business relationship with Rap7. So the Metasploit framework, we're about 400,000 lines of code before the acquisition, and as of now, 4 or 5 months after the acquisition itself, we've gone up by at least 100,000 lines of code.
but no matter how you count it, it's at least 100,000 lines. This is the graph from olo.net, which you can look up yourself and look at the stats. You can see this giant bump right here at the end is when the acquisition happened, and the kind of taper off here is our preparing for the Express release. So we're going to get back on full-time Express development with 3.4.0 after the conference. But you can see we've a huge noticeable bump in terms of development speed. Since the release, we used to do releases about once per year. Every 12 months, we have a new release come out. Since Rap7 acquired the project, we've done 4 releases, 1 major and 3 points. We plan on doing the 3.4.0 release, as soon as humanly possible, probably next week, a week and a half from now, maybe even 2 weeks from now, depending on how things go. We're shooting for mid-May. It may drag out depending on how QA goes. The nice thing about having Rap7 behind the project now is we actually have QA. So we'll talk more about kind of how that's affected the project, but for the most part, things mostly work now when we do a release, as opposed to me spending my weekend testing it before going back to work again. So it's nice to be able to do this stuff full time. So just a quick review of some of the things that we've come up with so far. Since Metasploit was acquired, we put out 3.3, 3.3.1, 3.3.2, 3.3.3, and now soon 3.4. Almost 100 new exploits in 3.3 was released in October. Now 3.3 was mostly a release that was just after the acquisition, so Rap7 didn't have, we hadn't ramped up our development resources yet. It's mostly a community release. Since then, we've done 100 exploits, which is actually more than we've ever done in that same period of time through the history of the project. And we can credit Joshua Drake for about 90 of those, so he's sitting over there being an exploit machine on idle. We've added both integration with the Nexpose vulnerability scanner, as well as Rap7 released the free version of Nexpose, which is the community edition that doesn't have any commercial restrictions, no delays on updates. If you, no matter where you work, what you do, you can, unless you're in Iran or Syria, you can download a copy of the community edition, set it up, run it, scan it, and it's entirely free to use as long as you want to use it. Huge updates to meterpreter. We ended up bringing Stephen Fewer on contract, who is the guy who's been working on a lot of our payload backends, and he's very happy to work on an open source project where he basically retains copyright, puts it under the BSD license, and puts it back in the public domain basically and gets paid for it. So he's really excited about the work, and we've been able to put a ton of features in the last few months because he's been really gung-ho about working on the project. Since October, we've re-implemented the entire pivoting backend of the Metasploit meterpreter payload, so it does forward and reverse TCP and UDP now. We haven't exposed that yet in terms of like a SOC service, but it's coming soon. We rewrote the entire threading backend of meterpreter as well, so every request now runs its own background thread, which means you can do a whole lot of things more at once. You can have background downloads, background scanning, background pivoting, all sorts of great things, and it doesn't actually stuff up the main service. We added 64-bit support to meterpreter and the ability to do migration from 32-bit to 64-bit back and forth. So as you see more people switching to 64-bit platforms, and a little bit of what I talked about in the keynote yesterday, they still run 32-bit applications on top of WoW64, which is the Win64 emulation layer. The great thing about the pivoting from 32 to 64 means you can compromise the vulnerable 32-bit program, then migrate into a 64-bit program, and then take over the desktop from there. In addition, we redid the entire SSL layer behind Metasploit. So the SSL layer is much stronger than it used to be. As of last week, with the ability to do full-blown, complete staging over SSL. So even the initial connection from the payload itself coming back to us is a full SSL connection that downloads the meterpreter code directly into memory and then initializes meterpreter, which does another SSL connection again. So as far as someone watching the network, unless you can man in the middle of the SSL connection, it's pure SSL from now on in that sense. So it's kind of nice. We haven't switched over from reverse TCP to the reverse HTTPS yet, but that's coming as soon as we finish some quality issues. One of the things that Josh worked on and the whole team kind of pulled through on was exploit ranking. And by pull through, I mean we cheered Josh on while he did it. Is he had to go through and rank every one of our 600 odd exploits. And he did a great job of going through and making sure that targets were reliable, automatic targets weren't set when they weren't the right target. Any exploits that had any kind of bugs or QA issues got solved during the process. We opened tickets, worked on it, cleaned it up. So the entire exploit base of Metasploit really got an overhaul the last 2 or 3 months. And the exploit rankings provide a really nice way to say, I only want to run exploits that won't crash the target, or I only want to run exploits that are guaranteed to work almost always, just because of the way they're designed. Or you can say, I want to run exploits that'll just crash things left and right because I want a shell, damn it. So however you look at it, there's a way to approach it using the exploit rankings. All the exploit changes resulted in mix-in changes, which resulted in library changes. So it really became a top-down overhaul and QA of Metasploit, going through these modules and checking them for correct behavior. We've had over 100 bugs fixed and found just since 3.3.3. And since basically 3.3, we've had something like 450 bugs fixed, and we still have about 200 more that are either user requests, tickets, suggestions, and a couple cases just pure bugs left to close out before 3.4.0. And now we're announcing 3.4, which is all the fun stuff. So I mentioned it before, but meterpreter had a huge update round, bidirectional T-spin UDP, socket relays, and then now threading in the back end. We redid the screen capture code, so it actually does session 0 isolation, and you don't have to migrate to capture the screen anymore. So the cool thing about the screen capture code is it actually uses unpublished technique to hijack the desktop. Hijack the desktop session using what's called session 0 isolation bypass, which is what Stephen Feuer came up with to go through this. The cool thing about this is it means screenshots now work on all new versions of Windows now. So Windows 7 64-bit, Windows Vista, it all works great. You don't have to migrate. You can do it from any process that has rights to the administrator's desktop or the running user's desktop. So that was a huge win just to get that working right. It took us forever to figure that out. Local privilege escalation is now implemented. You can just type use priv and get system on a meterpreter shell, and it'll try to get you system. And there's a whole lots of little fun things to do it. One thing that's new on new versions of Windows 7 and Windows Vista to some extent, the admin user no longer has debug privileges. So if you're the admin user, even if you authenticate via UAC, you don't have debug privileges, you can't migrate. So this uses all sorts of fun tricks to start a service in the background, connect the pipe to the service, hand a token back off to the admin user, get the admin user to get a debug privileges that way. So get system is the magic one-line command that now gets you system access to a target. And if you're vulnerable to Tavis Orbity's KI trap debug, it then uses that for privilege escalation as well. So all sorts of really cool things rolled into one nice command, and that's just the very beginning of our privilege escalation support. We plan on doing a whole lot more going forward. All the token manipulation stuff is different. Every thread in Meterpreter now has its own token. This is a little bit nitty-gritty, but I'll fly through a little bit. Anyways, lots of fun stuff. All the incognito features are being rolled into the main metasploit, basically, if you're familiar with those. 64-bit support that we talked about, migrate back and forth from 32 to 64, back and forth. So wherever you need to be, you can be. We overhauled the VNC injection payload, which is a lot of fun. That basically lets you go straight to an interactive desktop of any target you compromise with Metasploit without installing any software right into the disk. This had the same challenge where you couldn't migrate to the session 0, the basically interactive desktop from a service on new versions of Windows because of the session 0 isolation. And we used the same trick that Stephen Feuer came up with for screenshots to bypass it on VNC. So another really neat way to go straight to a desktop even when you theoretically shouldn't be allowed to. And it's a lot more responsive than it used to be. We upgraded the whole thing to tight VNC. Finally, we looked at kind of what people were using security tools for, and one of the biggest gaps we saw were in the brute force realm. I mean, there's tools like Medusa and Hydra, THC Crack, lots of things like that people use from day to day on the pen testing side. And there's some vuln scanners, and even Expose does some default password checks, but there's nothing really conclusive or comprehensive out there in terms of brute forcing multiple protocols, but then also using those authentication credentials to go do something else. Like Medusa will get you credentials, but it won't give you a shell. And I want a shell. So we went through and we overhauled the SMB brute forcer, MySQL, Postgres, MS SQL, IBM DB2, Telnet, SH, Tomcat, and HTTP. So in every case where we can crack a password and get a password from one of the various sources that we pull it from, we'll automatically open up a session too. So you can use a default Tomcat username and password, and we pulled in all the weird vendor defaults as well, to immediately upload a meterpreter shell or a Linux remote shell on a vulnerable target. So really nice way. That included creating a support for war archive files, also supports JBoss, lots of fun things there. So a lot more support for compromising databases, a lot more support for compromising application servers. And one of the neat things about the generic HTTP one is this finds you just tons and tons of vulnerable devices. All those crappy little printers and switches you find in the network during normal assessment, this one will just basically brute force them to find out the default password. And something a little bit different about how we built the brute force support and the default passwords is we didn't just go and grab the default password list from Finio Elite or one of the other websites out there. We actually spent 2 days over the weekend doing searches for file type, PDF, in URL, product manual, and going through every product manual of every product we could find with the word SSH or Telnet in it, pulling the defaults out of the PDFs, adding it to our files. So the defaults in Metasploit 3.4 are actually much more accurate than even the existing password lists that are available. One of the cool things we added was the ability to automate command shells. So before, if you want to do fancy scripting, you can only do it on a meterpreter shell, but that doesn't really buy you much when you're on a Linux shell. So we now have the ability to do full-blown automation on Linux shells, Unix shells, Cisco device shells, 3COM shells, whatever have you. If it's a stream socket, you can talk to it, you can automate it without having to write a plugin for it. One of the cool things that Josh worked on is be able to upgrade any Windows command shell session you have into a real meterpreter shell using all kinds of crazy command line foo, and it all works pretty nice now. So you can do session-u and ID number of a command shell, and it becomes a meterpreter shell. So, and since then, of course, 60 new exploits and over 40 auxiliary modules. This is actually at 62 or 63 now, depending on what time you update and how busy Josh is at the given point. So a little bit about security and pen testing in general. There's a lot of things that just aren't really that great with this data security these days, and this is kind of where we went, what we started to look at when we started doing the design specification for Metasploit Express. And everyone likes to text message me while I talk. Let's see. So if you look at it overall, it's positive, but it's pretty slow progress. There's a huge group of researchers out there. They all do really cool stuff. There's lots of cool techniques and tools being used. Lots of compliance bodies are saying you must have security, you must do these things, all your different regulatory bodies out there. It's slowly improving the communication between researchers and vendors and corporations. The relationships are still getting better, or in cases where they're just unsolvable, they're just getting avoided and worked around, either through companies like programs like ZDI or iDefense, where they just buy the vulnerabilities and treat it and handle it that way. Either way, security in general it's moving forward, but it's not really going leaps and bounds forward. Not like it was 4 or 5 years ago when things just changed much quicker than they do today. The downside is almost all the innovation in the security field right now is being locked into commercial products. If there's a new exploit technique, if there's a new evasion technique, if there's a new testing method, if there's a new web application system, very rarely do you see tools being published these days that do whatever that new thing is. It all gets rolled into whatever the researcher's company's product is and used as kind of a selling point, like I'm doing now. It's a selling point. The difference is all the stuff that we're working on goes straight to the open source tree, and it goes in the open source tree first. So anything cool we work on, any of the fun payload stuff, any of the automation stuff, it's still going straight to the open source tree, and we're not trying to screw the community in any sense in terms of how we do development or how we innovate going forward. So there's a lot of challenges out there. I mean, very few companies still proactively test their security. We're talking to a gentleman in town, asking him if he wants to be a beta tester for Metasploit Express, just a friend of mine, and he's saying, well, we like to do security stuff since we are IT security, but we're not allowed to because we're too busy fixing desktops from viruses. And it's like, so you're spending your time fixing desktops from malware installations that you could be doing something about to prevent in the first place. Yeah, but if we don't work on that, then we look like we're not doing our job. It's like, well, what if you're doing vulnerability scanning, vulnerability testing, and exploits, and this and that? Well, they see that it's a waste of time. So there's still companies out there, and this isn't a small company. This is probably a Fortune 1000 that just don't take proactive security testing seriously. They see security as a cost center, as a maintenance hassle, but they don't do much to proactively, reduce those costs by doing scanning, pen testing, things like that. There's very limited adoption based on the existing solutions because what's out there right now is pretty complicated. If you hand your general, run-of-the-mill admin a copy of Metasploit and say, here, go, they're going to look at you like you're freaking crazy and be like, go what? They're probably going to tell you to go do something else. But yeah, what's this weird, crazy black and white console? I have no idea what to type in this thing. I mean, is this DOS? It doesn't seem like DOS. So you're going to have a lot of problems with just folks, unless the tool is really intuitive to use, you're not going to get a lot of adoption. You're not going to really see big changes in how people do their testing. And there are great, nice, GUI, clickable tools out there, but a lot of them are way outside the budget of these organizations. And if your choice is, I can either hire a new body for this price, or I can buy a tool for it, you're probably going to hire a body because they can at least respond when you yell at them, as opposed to sit there and tick and spin little spinners. So it's more satisfying to be able to yell at a body on a program for the same price point. So a lot of solutions out there are pretty complicated, and none of these solutions really talk together or work well together. You can take data. There are some exceptions, like a lot of the Archer products, a lot of the other Seam style products really do lots of correlation integration, but they don't really do it with the cooperation of the vendors a lot of times. They just say, okay, we're going to figure out your data format and import it. Security tools are probably the worst out there because everyone's fighting over the same small niche of the industry space that no one wants to integrate with anybody else because it's, if you integrate someone else's product, you get all the benefit, they don't. So that's the fun thing when you look at kind of integrations happening these days. It's almost aggressive integrations happening in some cases. We look at it as kind of we want to integrate with everyone we possibly can because we not only want to be consumer of data, we want to be a producer of data. And one of the major overhauls that happened in version 3.40 of Metasploit that's coming out and the Metasploit Express product we're going to talk about is the entire database schema was revamped. So everything you do once you've enabled database support, it tracks your history, it tracks your commands, it tracks your logins, it tracks every host you test, every data that it captures from any system you touch. All that goes into a database and you can easily export that. So we're really looking at interoperability as one of the big benefits of using the Metasploit and Nextpost products. Both those products do import and export. And you look at generally how much pen tests cost organizations. If you actually hire a commercial consulting team to come in and do a pen testing, it can be really expensive if you're a small company. If you're looking at, do I pay the mortgage or do I hire a pen test company, no matter what the regulatory body says you have to do, you're probably going to pay your mortgage. You're probably going to do what you need to do to keep your business running. Security is always going to become second to survivability. So you look at the current pen test stuff, and you can either hire someone for crazy amounts of money, you can buy expensive tools for crazy amounts of money, you can use cheap and free tools for low amounts of money, but a huge time commitment and maybe a skill set that you may or may not have on staff. And there's not really much in the middle today. which brings us to Metasploit Express. So we're really trying to make security and penetration testing and some of the penetration testing techniques themselves mainstream. We're trying to take the things that your day-to-day pen testers have been doing for 10 years, put into a tool, add a button, and say go. I mean, this isn't hard stuff. Like pass the hash. How many tools out there, commercial security testing tools, have a pass the hash button? It's unheard of. Like this is the most common way you own a huge domain within a Windows environment, and yet nothing out there really demonstrates for the user. This isn't the point when it's like, here's the secret techniques used by the hackers and pen testers to do this type of work. These things are so well known today that they're almost a given for a pen test, yet they're not really included in the tool sets. So we looked at what are the things that the tools today don't do? What are things we do as pen testers that we can't find a tool to do for us, so we spend all of our time on? So we actually used the internal RAP7 pen test team. We talked to a lot of our friends. We talked to a lot of our associates through both the Metasploit contributor program, through partners we have in the industry. And we came up with a list of here's the things we need to do to really make a tool that's effective for pen testers. Not just pen testers, but easy enough to use that your average admin can at least walk through some of the main things that a pen tester is going to do and get those out of the way first. I mean, there's no point in paying someone for 20 hours of work that's basically button clicking if you can do it yourself. So the primary parts of Metasploit Express are we want to make sure it's easy to use. So anyone should be able to start this thing up, get running, any platform, any supported platform. Right now it's Windows and Linux, and get rolling with it. It should be intuitive. It should do what you need to do. You shouldn't have to have a huge in-depth experience of security and a huge background and everything around pen testing to be able to use this thing. You should be able to prioritize your exploitable risk. You should be able to say, based on the results of this thing, I know what I need to go fix. I need to know what changes I have to make to stop this thing from working. The downside of working on a security tool like Metasploit is the better job you do at remediation, the better job you do of telling the user what to do, the less your tool is going to work. So it's kind of it's a bad cycle. Like your best case scenario is when your tool is no longer useful in terms of how it works in the network. And that's the downside, but that's the practical truth. And what happens is we rarely see networks ever get to that level when it's not useful. And that's kind of scary. So we need to be doing more to push that envelope. And finally, it needs to be easily affordable. It can't be something you have to go spend the equivalent of a yearly salary on to bring a tool in-house, because for that price, you can just basically stick some guy in a box, hand him a bunch of manuals, and tell him to go for 2 months until they know what they're doing. Depending on who the person is and whether they like living in a box. At the same time, though, I mean, the value has to be there. The value has to be there for the tool to be worth that type of price. So this is what Metasploit looks like today, and a lot of people like this, use it. We have now fancy colors, and I actually like the console. I use it for everything. I can do just about everything in like 3 keystrokes, with 2 of them being tabs. It's great. If you know what you're doing, it's awesome. It's fast. You're good. Where we're going though looks a little bit different. So big spiffy UI with little clicky tabs, reporting, host interfaces, all that fun stuff. We'll get more into the UI side and screenshots, demos, and then the live hands-on demo after this. But the idea here is that you've got some pretty simple things you want to track. You want to look at your overview. You want to see what hosts you found. You want to see what sessions you have, your current active access to targets. You want to be able to generate reports and look at them. And sometimes you want to get your hands dirty and just jump in and run modules manually and do a particular task by hand. And you also want to track all of your background tasks. So that's kind of the basic layout. In this example, you can see it's 11 sessions are open, 4 passwords are cracked, found 357 hosts, 1,527 services. Pretty straightforward stuff. When we go to the demo, I'll show off a lot of the cool features. Basically, everything this product does on the front end translates to a Metasploit module on the back end with certain parameters and certain information. All the information about what modules run, how it's run, when it's run, that's all stored in the database, and you can export it back out as an RC script. They can either load, you just look at by hand to go do your work, or you can actually export it and load it into the free version of Metasploit and use it that way. So what we're trying to do is, if you're a pen tester and you're going on site to a customer and you do an automated pen test, a couple clicks into it, you're done, you got your shells, you can actually export automation scripts that repeat exactly what you did where successful. That's usable with the free version of Metasploit, and leave it behind with the customer so they can actually verify your work after they're done. So if they patch your system, they can go through and say, okay, now does the exploit work? And have a pretty, you're not charging them for it, it's just a nice add-on to leave behind. And because we have an open source product, because we have an open architecture and open everything for the most part, that's not threatening to us in terms of a commercial provider of tools. We think that's a really good use case. Not everyone's going to want to buy the product, not everyone's going to want to use it for what we use it for, but in cases where it does make sense, we want to make sure they're interoperable. So we asked a bunch of folks about what are the things that drive you crazy about pen testing. These aren't necessarily your hardcore pen testers, which have entirely different set of requirements. These are folks who have to do it day to day, either as their part of their main job or something they just do occasionally when they get dragged into bigger teams. Sometimes this applies to the hardcore folks as well, but they generally have their own mindset in terms of how they address these problems. So the biggest one here is I wish pen testing was faster. I mean, it's a long, long time to really do a good pen test across a large network. Even if it's only 200 hosts, you're probably going to spend a week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks. I mean, you can spend as long as you want to on a given network and keep finding stuff. That's the great thing about it. I mean, even after you compromise a host, you have to go through all the data files. Once you go through the data files, you have to decrypt all the documents. Once you go through the documents, you find even more stuff. I mean, you just keep going and going when you start getting data. So what can we do to basically speed up the initial process, speed up the initial both entry and data gathering? So what we do with Metasploit Express is we deliver a really simple penetration testing workflow. You scan, you import, you run vuln scanners if you want to. Basically, that's all in the discovery stage. Then you can do things like brute force and exploit. And as you compromise systems, you can dump passwords through evidence collection. Then as you dump passwords, you can reuse those passwords automatically and compromise even further. So in one example, and this is kind of jumping the gun a bit, but for a particular target network I was working on, I scanned 6 machines. I found one of them was vulnerable to MSO 8067. It was supposed to be vulnerable. It was a target box. It was a certain level of a target that was supposed to be vulnerable. I ran the evidence collection in Metasploit Express on it, dumped the password hashes, and then scanned the entire network and told it to try it again. Now just try just the password hashes that I pulled before. Well, now I've gotten to 15 machines, and one of those wasn't a target box. One of them was just someone's workstation that had a shared account on it. So I said, okay, let's compromise that. Let's dump the password hash. Let's try it again. I got it to 35 machines. Again, got it to 65 machines. Again, I finally ended up with 97 sessions across a network that was theoretically secure. Like, every patch was installed on every other system on the network except for that one target box that I happened to scan. But what happened was because one person shared passwords on these 2 boxes, then another 3 people shared passwords in 3 other boxes, and so on, you kept widening your circle of access. And I did the whole thing through Metasploit Express in about 20 minutes. And that type of testing usually takes a long time to do by hand. It's usually a pain in the ass if you're using existing security tools for it. So that's one example of the things we're trying to do with Metasploit Express. The automated exploitation uses the exploit ranking system automatically. So you say only run the safe ones, only runs exploits of this level. And it goes through the entire Metasploit module set. If you happen to add your own module to the module tree, it's going to go ahead and load those things up and run it just like normal. So as long as you've got the right rankings in your own custom module kit, you can use your own existing modules, no changes with Metasploit Express. We have probably the easiest brute force system ever. We have a brute force button, and you click it and it brute forces. Now, if you want to get like granular, you can actually go through and check off protocols and tune things and say fast, deep, specify your own credentials. But by default, it just does stuff. And what it does is actually pretty interesting. It uses not only all the defaults, but it'll actually tune things based on the target network. So if you enumerate, as part of the scan process, if you enumerate the user accounts of one Windows machine or even a Unix box or Mac OS X box via SMB services or via Finger on a Solaris machine or an old, whatever you have sitting around running Finger, it'll then use those usernames automatically in the brute force. If you compromise a password in any system, whether it's SMB, whether it's a brute force someplace else, whether it's part of evidence collection, it then reuses those credentials again across all the systems. So it's a really neat way to kind of keep sharing, use information network-wide to generate passwords and possible usernames across every other service. So this is a lot of fun for SMB because you can pass the hash trick. For other protocols like SSH, it's a great way to find a default account that people have the same default account across the entire network. You say, what was the default password we used when we did imaging of these systems? Okay, now enter that one into the text box. Now let's run the whole thing and make sure no one else still has that password set. So really common pen testing tasks and even security auditing tasks are much easier to do through this framework than anything I've found so far. The shared password detection stuff is awesome. Anytime you've got a password that's been found, it automatically gets used unless you tell it not to. And you can do a brute force of just the known passwords, which is a great way to see whether the passwords you found so far are being used elsewhere. And of course, you can manage multiple background tasks. It doesn't really have a limit on it, but depending on how fast your machine is, you probably don't want to go over 20 or 30. But for most situations, you're only going to run 3 or 4 at the most anyways. The cool thing about the development team is it includes 3 former pen testers on the team itself writing this code. So as we're going through this, we're like, does this make sense? Is this something I'm actually going to want to use on a real network? And our worry is this is going to end up like that Simpsons episode where Homer gets to build a car. And he starts, the thing ends up having like 4 steering wheels and 3 hoods and 5 wheels on it. But we think what we have is actually usable. Even though it is kind of specialized for pen testing, we think it is broadly usable. And hopefully the UI will make it more usable to folks even without a strong security background. So next. I wish my tools interoperated. Just right now, tools are terrible at doing stuff. One of our researchers, Joshua Abraham, wrote an entire XML parsing toolkit that all it does is take data from disparate tools, connect them together, and let you do cool automation tricks. So kind of like a Unix pipeline for existing open source security tools. And that's great, but that doesn't really apply to most commercial products yet. So for Metasploit Express, we deliver a native integration with Rapid7's Nexpose. You can actually run an Nexpose scan directly from the user interface, look at the results, import it, everything from there. It can integrate directly with Nmap. We actually use Nmap internally. We don't hide the fact we don't use Nmap. We actually have a license to use Nmap. It's one of those cases where, as a company, we're really focused on when we use open source, we're very proud of the open source that we use, and we're not trying to hide it. So if you know exactly what you want to get done with Nmap, you can basically run your own Nmap scan, import it into it, and use it. I mean, we're not going to try to say that our scanner is better than Nmap. We're going to say that Nmap is the best scanner and use it. And that's generally the approach we take for a lot of the product development, is we're not going to reinvent wheels when we don't have to, especially when there's already existing great solutions out there. We can import data from different scanners, even scanners that aren't Nexpos. So I think at this point we support for QualScar, Nessus 1, Nessus 2, MBE. We should have support for Saint soon, and there's a couple other products on the roadmap right now that we should be able to get in soon once we have a sample. The cool thing about the structure of Metasploit Express is that we're not just a consumer of data. We can export everything back out. So everything that's being stored in the database internal in Metasploit Express is exact same database schema that's being used in the free version of Metasploit. So they go back and forth. If you do a pen test after enabling the free version of Metasploit and then use the same database for Express, your data's still there. You can export it back out. You can import it back in. And the data exports are either raw XML, which delineate all everything you did in the network, all the commands you ran, all the information about the targets, or you can do a raw XML inside of a zip file with all the data files. That includes all your PW dump files, includes all your screenshots, all your other data from the target network, and that's a great way to give a deliverable to the client. Say, here's exactly what I did, when I did it, how I did it, in a format you can actually parse with a script. One of the major changes in 3.4.0 was really fleshing out the XML RPC interface that's in the backend of Metasploit. Does anyone here actually use the XML RPC backend? All right, there's a couple of there's 3 people that have actually used it. There's Ryan Lin, who works on the Beef project, and he also works on the Nsploit, the Nmap integration with Metasploit. They both use the XML RPC, both of those projects use the XML RPC backend. Basically, everything you can do in Metasploit, you can basically automate through an XML RPC channel that's encrypted through SSL and authenticated. The Metasploit Express product itself uses the exact same communication channel. It just adds a couple additional APIs on top, and gives you new features. So once we go through the UI and start demonstrating what it can do and how it does it, everything that we're going to do through the UI, you can now do from the command line through that XML RPC interface and integrate it with your tools however you want to do it. It's the same protocol and same stack as open source version, just with a couple additional APIs on top. So one of the last things, or the third thing I want to talk about is testing with confidence. A lot of folks like using DB Autopwn, which we think is kind of like script kiddie shotgun mode, where it just goes out and fires exploits at everything randomly. I mean, you're more than likely going to shut your whole network down using it, but it's a lot of fun just to see what happens sometimes. It's not something you actually want to use in the customer network in any sense. So when we looked at building Metasploit Express, we realized that the shotgun mode approach exploit launching isn't going to work. And we look at how some other products handle it, and we think we've got a good approach. So first we use reliability rankings to create tiers within the products. We say, here's the ones that are excellent ranking. These are ones that can't crash anything. They're not even overflows. So things like command line injection, they exploit all sorts of fun data access vulnerabilities, but they aren't going to actually trigger an overflow in any sense. Then you look at ones that on the next tier down that are really, really reliable exploits, where they automatically detect their target, and they're if they don't know the target, they bail out, or when they do know their target, they use an exploit, the return address that's really accurate. And finally, once we do have the list of exploits that are broken into those tiers, we rank them, we order them based on what CVID they're going to be running. And this will be part of beta 3. So we always run the older ones first. So it's going to see what the oldest possible vulnerability you possibly have is first for each ranking, and then use that to break in. It's also going to go through and prevent you from running multiple exploits in the same port at the same time. You're not going to want to run your 2 or 3 different SMB-based exploits across the same SMB service and the same target at the same time, or whichever one happens to work first is going to crash the next one, and the whole thing is going to shut down. So the idea is we want to be safe about it. So in cases where the exploit is not an excellent ranked exploit, it's something where it triggers memory corruption, we make sure we only run exactly 1 exploit per time per service in the order that is least likely to cause a crash before we get a shell. So there's a whole nice analysis system built into it that makes testing a lot safer this way. You can say, I want to run just the excellent ranking ones and not trigger any kind of memory corruption. This system also automatically detects things like printers and routers and crappy switches, and will actually blacklist them automatically from exploits. So if it finds your HP jet direct, it's not going to cause your jet direct to spew pages for 10 days. It's going to figure that out and say, no thanks, it's okay. Now, if you want your jet direct to spew pages, or you're worried about someone actually hiding a banner because they make it look like a printer, you can uncheck that box and move on if you want to. And finally, you can do things like throttle the speed, the concurrency. You can also leverage the smart payload connection stuff. So normally in Metasploit, with every module you run, you have to tell what payload to use, and then that indicates what connection type to use too. Whether it's reverse connect, whether it's a bind shell. Based on the information that we have from the scan, we'll actually look at, if we're on the same local network as the target, we're going to use a reverse connect by default, and that works fine. If the target is behind a firewall, or we see that there's some other kind of rule in place, or we're behind a NAT gateway and the target's not, we're actually going to use the port scan data to figure out what ports are open on the target, automatically use a bind shell on that port, and then use it automatically. So it has a nice little smart allocator that tells you what ports to use based on that. So it saves you another step in metasploit too if you're used to the standard interface. And finally, or not finally, but almost finally, I wish I had support for metasploit. People have been asking for commercial support for a long time. It's something that, where the product is broad as metasploit is right now, you can't really train anyone to support all of it. I mean, I don't know all of the product. I mean, the other guys that work on the project, we all know 80% of it, but there's definitely gaps in between where we have, one of the great things about metasploit is lots of people contribute to it, so we have lots of functional areas that are just really wide and deep all by themselves. Like, for example, the WMAP backend. It'd be really tough to provide support for WMAP because it's kind of an optional component that's part of the main framework, but not really part of the core. So we looked at how do you want to support this? And what we ended up coming up with is we have full commercial support for Metasploit Express with SLAs. We also provide partial support for Metasploit framework by itself as part of the same contract and same purchase. So for the same purchase price, same yearly contract, you get the SLAs and support for both. And it's limited support for Metasploit framework just because the framework is big enough. You don't want to support MSF encode or MSFP scan the command line. In most cases, you can just go on IRC and ask us anyways, and we'll answer your question. So not too big of a deal. And finally, I wish pen testing software is actually affordable. If you look at the market today, there's a lot of low-end providers that when you actually add in their support cost and yearly maintenance cost, early updates, this and that, the numbers just get huge. You're looking at around like $7,000, $10,000 for most products in the market today with all the updates included for the first year. If you look at the high-end players, you're looking at close to $60,000 as a minimum buy-in for the product. And it doesn't really work very well with small companies and small enterprises. So we're shooting for exactly $3,000 per year per user. So hopefully it's right in the middle. We think it's a good price point. We think it's actually affordable for the small and consultants. And we think we're providing enough value to more than justify the price point based on what it does. So a quick jump into the workflow. This is the general process that Metasploit Express goes through. And keep in mind, you can skip steps. You can jump ahead to one, you can move back, you can do anything you want, whatever order you want. But this is the recommended data flow. You start off doing some kind of scan, whether it's our own internal scan engine, which is based on Metasploit modules and Nmap, whether it's importing an Expose or Nmap scan you did yourself, or scan from another supported third-party product. You can actually run an Expo scan directly, load that data into the product automatically, and move on. And you can add devices by hand. So if you don't want to trip an IPS or another box network, you want to be kind of stealthy about it, you can actually add devices by hand into the interface, add nodes, add services, and then launch exploits based on how you configure it as well. So it doesn't necessarily have to have this recon information. It just works better when it's available. The next step you want to do is actually gain access. And this is either through brute forcing, exploiting, or manually exploiting. So for example, if you want to run a client-side exploit, you can go to you pick the module you want, set it up, it runs as a background task, and your shells show up just like they normally do in the interface for automated exploits. Brute force, it'll actually automatically get a shell unless you tell it not to for every supported service that supports that, like MS SQL, Tomcat, SSH, Telnet, et cetera. And of course, automated exploit engine itself. But the key thing is we realize pen testing isn't just about having exploits. Like most pen testers only use exploits for the first 5-10% of the job, and everything else after that is drilling down, getting information, sifting information, using that information to get to the next step. And that's really where we're trying to go with Metasploit Express. Exploits are great, but the exploits are not going to be the be-all, end-all of a pen test. They never have been. Way too much importance gets put on the existence of 0 days for pen testing because your customer doesn't really care if you use 0 days a lot of times. They're like, great, use something I can't defend against. Do you want a cookie? Like, there's really not much they can do about it. So telling them to use the 0 day for a pen test isn't really fair in a lot of cases. It's a good example of what a real attacker can do, but it's not necessarily fair to them in terms of how they can defend against it, besides doing defense in depth, things like that. So we're not trying to focus entirely on exploits. We think they're important. We're going to keep up to date. We're going to keep funneling resources into it. But we're also going to work on everything else you do during a pen test, which is mostly data analysis, brute force, password reuse, exploiting weak configurations, exploiting weak devices. The great thing about the brute force check is it'll actually bust shells on Cisco's, on printers, on all kinds of random devices by guessing the passwords as well. And then you have an actual interactive shell you can type on and do stuff with, and all your input and output gets logged just like normal in Metasploit Express. So if it guesses a Cisco password and drops you to a Cisco shell, everything you type in that shell and automate is going to get stored and logged just like everything else you do. And if you do the evidence collection on a Cisco device, it's going to do a show config and bring as much data down from the device as it can automatically and include that into the report. So finally, when you actually have your sessions, you can drop to a straight command shell if you want to. You can use the standard meterpreter session interface if you like that. We also have a file browser, a VNC plugin, so you go straight to VNC in your browser without having to run anything externally. All sorts of fun kind of automation bits built into the UI for that. And finally, you've got your reporting. So the cool thing about a reporting is you don't have to just do a batch mode reporting. You can look at your live report anytime, anywhere. So if you just do a scan, you want to look at the report of the network, great, pull it up, you're done. If you go through and you do, compromise 5 machines and that's it, you can look at the report of that and generate that report for somebody. Or you can go through and do your full-blown pen test, gather data, gather passwords, break everything possible, get screenshots, and then generate a report with all that data in it as well. It kind of gives you a live snapshot of your existing data from a report sense. If you want a report that's kind of generated and static and doesn't change, we have the ability to generate PDF, Word, and HTML reports in the background, and those work just fine. You can also generate the zip file exports of all of your data as well as your XML, or just your XML as well too. And of course, the idea here is after you get to the step of collecting evidence, you go back around and start your discovery all over again. So what I like to do is after I compromise one machine via SMB and I get a domain account, I'll plug that back into the discovery engine and say, okay, now go do discovery, but use the credentials that I have that I got by compromising this machine over there. It's then going to go through and as part of the normal discovery process, enumerate every user, enumerate every share, and now when you do your brute force again, it has a much wider list of users to go through and brute force. So you just keep feeding data back into the system until it's basically done. And in the example I talked about earlier, done took 20 minutes and got 97 shells from one vulnerable target. So there's a lot, it just goes a lot further than a lot of tools in the market. So I want to do a quick demo real quick of the Express workflow. After this, we'll go into kind of a side-by-side comparison of Metasploit Free versus Metasploit Express, kind of give you an idea where that lines up, and then after that, we can do hands-on demos outside. So first off, it's a web product. So probably no surprise there. Everyone uses web interfaces these days, and Nexpose also uses a web interface. Once you install it, you have to create a user account, and from the user account, you create your first project. After your user account's created, you basically get dumped in a screen like this. Login box, password, it's over SSL, it uses Apache, it uses Mongrel or Thin on the back end. Self-signed cert, you can swap the cert out if you want to install your own SSL certificate. So once you log in, you get a list of projects. And normally, it's not so much divided into sites so much as projects because this data is almost temporal. You're not going to want to go through and use the same pen test template for a month or two in a row with the same data because things change too much. This stuff is pretty much it's temporal data. It's stuff that it gives you a snapshot of the network right then and right there, and you probably want to create a project for each engagement you do. What we're working on in the future is going through and actually creating templates. You can then clone the template to go forward as your base, but right now you create a new project for every engagement. So in this case, we're going to say source Boston, and let me find out what network range it's using. I'm on host mode VMware. It's a little bit crazy. Most cases, it'll actually tell you what network range it defaults it. In this case, I've changed my IP address like 6 times since I started it up, so it's a little bit confused. So we're going to scan the entire /24 subnet. Oh, sorry, we're going to create the project, and you can see we've got a bunch of options here. Scan, import, Nexpose. From Nexpose, you can see we can run a scan, plug in our credentials. Import, we can import a bunch of different data types. Scan has some different options on it. It's actually, I think my resolution's under the supported size, so it's scrolling off right now. But basically, you can say, give it the defaults and tell it to pick its own default port range, which is pretty comprehensive. It's everything we have an exploit for, plus additional services. You can say, scan this range, but exclude these few targets over here to the side. You can also go through and say, I want to scan the default ports plus these additional ports I know are running web servers or secure shell or some other service you want to target. Or you can say, I want to scan everything but this one port, or you can give it an entirely custom port range like 1 to 65535 and scan every port of the network if you want to. And these options just get passed down to Nmap, basically. There's nothing really fancy about it. UDP Discovery uses our internal auxiliary discovery module that's in Metasploit, so there shouldn't be any surprises there, but does a lot of really cool things. Identify known services. We'll come back to a second pass on the services it couldn't figure out the first time with nmaps-sv option, and then use that information to normalize it and then launch exploits based on what protocols it finds. So it should automatically find web servers, SMB servers, things like that automatically when you have this option enabled. You can also give it an optional username and password over here. This also includes your landman hash. You can just paste the hash into it and it uses it directly. So let's go through and use the existing username and password to do better enumeration early on. And you can give it like speed and whatnot, speed and timeouts. So we'll tell it to go insane because you don't want to sit here and watch it forever. After you launch a task, you get basically punted to the task log. We're probably going to change this around later on, so it's a little bit less distracting to go straight to it. But you can see basically every command line being run, every option being passed, every module. It automatically scrolls through. So you can see here's kind of the list of the ports we're running. It's a huge port list, lots of fancy options to it. But all we're really trying to do is make sure we cover all the ports we have exploits for and do things in a pretty fast way. Now, if we want to go back to the main listing again and not have to watch the task log, we can just sit here and wait till it's done. And at this point, you can run an expo scan, you can do anything else you want to do at this point while you're waiting for any particular background task to finish. This is actually generally pretty quick. I think we're just waiting for Nmap to finish, then everything else should fly through. So first target's coming through. VMware host mode gets a little bit crazy with Nmap, so I was running NAT mode previously, and I kept crashing the NAT mode driver. So hopefully this will work. Worst case, we'll go outside and use the demo machines afterwards. There we go. So you'll see the first thing it did so far is Nmap. Now it's going through and doing the UDP probes. So it's just probing every target. You can see it's 7% into it. You can have lots of background tasks. You can stop them whenever you want to. The nice thing about this is you can close your browser, walk away, and it all works on its own. It's not tied to the browser or the instance. It runs in a background process. So you can have lots of background stuff running, keep your exploits running in the background on a target. The software installs just fine on a remote headless server too. So you can install this on a target box, stick it on a colo cloud, add all your listeners to it, and just check on it once now and then to get your sessions and interact with it. So it's not something where you're basically tied to running it locally on a desktop. You can put it anywhere you want, anything running Linux or Windows at this point. So this hopefully will be done here in a second. You can see it's pulling up SNMP information, NTP, SMB, NetBIOS, all sorts of things. It's a pretty small target network, but so it should go pretty quick here. So now that it's got some targets, you'll see them start to show up in the host table. And you don't have fancy OS information until it's done with the fingerprinting side, but you have a basic list of what targets are available. So I've got a couple XPs, Windows 2000 target, another Windows 2008, I think, the host machine itself, and then I think this is actually the scanning target, scanning machine. If not, we'll find out here in a second. So it's going through and it says, hey, I found a SQL server, so I'm going to start probing SQL automatically. It's not going to run probes for services it didn't find during the scan. So it's pretty smart about not trying to check things it's already looked for before. The nice thing about a lot of these things is it gathers information that's a little bit more in depth than most vuln scanning products will, because it gathers information it needs to actually run the exploit. So it's much more concerned about what information do I need about the service to exploit it, not just what vulnerabilities are available or anything else about it. So we've gone through and we finished everything else. Now at this point, we're just going through and normalizing services and trying to identify the ones that didn't figure out the first round. And it's still a little slow, but you can see we've got our target list of systems, 2000 box, XP, 2008 server, XP, another Linux box, and a Windows 7 box, which is actually the host here. So let's look at a really wide open one because they're easy. That's not it. Where's my 2000? So here you can see the MAC address, you can see status, whether it's been scanned or what. You can see the full service list and information that was found on it. If you look at the vuln list, you'll see there's no vulns yet because we didn't import a vuln scanner or use one. If you look at the share list, it should, there's no shares in this target. Evidence, no evidence has been collected yet, but we do have some notes. And these are kind of ugly still, still beta product. You can see that I enumerated all the user accounts and what IDs they were. So we got administrator, guest, iUser, IWAM, TS Internet user. So let's move back. And even though the scan process hasn't finished with unknown services, we can keep on just moving on. It doesn't really prevent us from going forward. So we're going to go through and do a brute force now. And you can see we've got all of our target IPs we found show up in the list. We can exclude stuff. We can add our own list of usernames and passwords to try here. We tell you the lockout risk for each protocol. So if it's SMB, it's probably going to lock it out if you don't configure it differently. Postgres, DB2, et cetera. Finally, you can say, do we want to automatically open sessions? Yes, we want sessions. Go. So this kicks off, and you'll see it goes through and tries to come up with an ordered username and password list for every target. So it's kind of hard to see in the screen here, but you'll see it's actually using the full username list off of the 2000 targets and then brute force other Windows machines as well. So even though it can't get the username listing off those other Windows targets because they're configured in a way that by default you can't do that, it's able to use leaked information from one target and then apply it to another, which is a great way to really go further in your pen test than you may otherwise or may not be able to do by hand. So as you can see, it already popped something over here. So we've got one host showed up with a notice on it. Let's go see what that notice is. And we can see now in the listing it shows cracked. So it got some kind of account on this target less than a minute ago. If you look in the notes table, we'll see, hey, it got an administrator with a blank password. So no surprise there. And we also found the guest account, but the guest account's disabled, so we added a note. If you do happen to lock out account, the lockout accounts will show on the bottom here. We're going to work on a better display for this. This is just currently the debug view of it. So the fun part is when it actually gets past the first round of brute force, it starts opening sessions. So we'll let that run for a second. And let's go ahead and kick off an exploit while we're at it. So we want to exploit everything. We don't want to exclude anything. Minimum reliability, great's fine. You can actually go down to average if you want most times without it being an issue. Current exploits, 5 is fine. We only do one session per target. There's a couple cases where that doesn't quite apply, but it usually tries to limit it to one command shell per target. You just don't really need more than one half the time. Ignore fragile devices like your printers. Skip exploits that don't match the OS. So it'll actually do fingerprinting on and compare the OS. And if for some reason it doesn't hit it, you can always click that off and go. So that's going to go through and start chewing along. This takes a little while to go through and match it all up. It tries to first create the huge exploit list and then prioritize it based on the rankings, and then based on the rankings, then reorders them based on the most likely per target, order in reverse order. The reverse order stuff's not quite working yet in this demo, but it will be available for the public beta next week. So you can see it's going 2 out of 7 hosts have been matched up so far. My poor laptop here is chugging on 15 VMs right now, so it's a little slow. And let's see. Let's go look at our brute force task. It should have moved on at this point. Nope, still doing SMB. All right, that's what I get for loading this box down too much. So far we've looked at 5 of the 7 targets, and we've found 197 possible exploits to match against. And we're still going to the last 2, and then it starts actually kicking off the exploit process. So when we actually get a session, it will show up under the Sessions tab, and they'll show up here based on what type they are. And all of your previous sessions show up as well, as long as full history. Now, the cool thing about the sessions listing is, we'll see it when it actually pops here in a second. Every time you get a shell on something through any kind of exploit, through any kind of username or password, it's going to show a link on the right-hand side to basically relaunch that same exploit. So if you come back the next day and your shell's dead, or you've closed it accidentally, or something went wrong, you can click on the link, rerun the same exploit, rerun the same brute force with just that username and password, get your shell again, and keep moving. So, and let's see. Once you have a shell, it's much easier to show off the rest of the features. So this is still crunching through an attack plan, it's still crunching through an SMB. We'll go ahead and look at it. So if you see in the bottom here, there's a list of recent events. If you go and look at show all events, you can see every single thing that runs in the back end of Metasploit gets logged here. So if you want to see exactly what parameters we're passing to the msql ping command, or msql ping, that was the wrong button. You can see the parameters being passed in here, basically. That's the module complete. We need the module run. So in this case, you can see we ran the SH version scanner against this target IP. Against this target IP with this port. It's hard to see in the screen. You'll see it better in the hands-on demo. How many threads, et cetera. So every single option of every module that gets run in the back end gets stored, logged, and can be rerun directly from the interface. So we want to go through and rerun the SH version module again because we're not sure that it's working right, or there's some other bug, we're trying to diagnose something. Click on that, bring it up in the interface, configure it however you want to do it, whatever options we want. We show the advanced options, enable evasion, however you want to do it, and tell it to go. And that applies to just about everything in the back end. Every exploit that gets run, every auxiliary module, every brute force. This is still just very slowly crunching along. So this is why we're beta.
It's good everyone can't read that.
Was it showing the password?
Yeah, the password was a little bit
Oh. Well, we use the top password lists, which do include things that are top passwords, which aren't necessarily the cleanest of words. Yep. Come on, demo gods. You can hear the fans kicking on. It's got like 8 cores and 12 gigs of RAM, and it's still about to melt down over here. Yeah. So we actually have a real server outside that does it all. Yeah. It's a little slow. See, crunching along. It's not using too much RAM. It's not too bad. Just a little bit laggy right now. Oh, at least it's easy to recover from. I'm going to call support right now. Ah, fine. That should be fine coming back up. It just got locked up for some reason. It's a problem with using, the latest bleeding edge to do demos. It tends to fall apart once in a while. There we go. So we'll go ahead and, so in this case, we know we cracked an account in this box. You'll see the task here shows completed because they died halfway through it. We're going to go ahead and trim it down a little bit to make the demo easier and not use too much of our time. So we're going to go ahead and do a brute force, and we're going to tell it to do just SMB, and we're going to tell it to use the depth of known, so only use the passwords that we've already found, basically. Tell it to go. This should just fly on through. It's going to try, there we go. Successful login, administrator, blank password, shell setup, session should show up here. Here's our session. We go straight to it. So we do things like collect system data. It'll do things like grab SH keys off the target, steal the private keys, steal your ID RSA files, then reuse those during the secure shell brute force. So lots of fun stuff in terms of how it collects data. You can tell it to go search for files with a certain name, like anything with like pass.xls or accounts.xls. You can tell it to automatically search for all that stuff. While that's running through the data collection side, we're going to go through and look at the VNC desktop feature, which is kind of fun. So you go click on it, and it'll go straight to the target, assuming I enable Java and get exploited by it. There it goes. So sitting around on a Windows 1000 desktop that we went straight to, we're done with it. We can just close the scary blue box that makes the admin scream, and then go ahead and close the window. And if you want to go through and browse the entire file system, there's a nice fancy web browser here for files. You can upload, download. You can even upload and run a backdoor if you have one that uses part of your normal pen test. If you see, we go through and download the boot.ini file. Instead of downloading it directly to your system or uploading directly to your system, it uploads it to the system running Metasploit Express, which then in turn uploads it to the target. So you get a really nice audit log of every single file you download, everything you uploaded, and those all show in the final reports if you want them to. So you can see we downloaded boot.ini. We want to show it. It says, hey, it's a text file. I'll actually show it to you here. And there's the download link here if you want to save a copy locally. And preserves like the file names and who owns it and all that fun stuff. So going back to the host list again, I know we're about out of time. So you'll see that the host now has changed from cracked to looted status, which means it stole the data off the box, and it's gone a little further than it would have otherwise. And you can see that because we did the data collection on it, it also grabbed a screenshot. So we have a nice little screenshot next to it that shows you exactly what was on the target's machine at the time. Let's go back. And if we scroll down to the, where's my evidence section? Evidence section, you'll see we have the screenshot, we have the note, we have the list of passwords we pulled off the system, we've got the list of processes running on it, we have just basic information about the target, including how long the user's been idle on the console, so you can see whether they walked away or whether they're right there when it happened, and all that which is automated. And since we are running short on time, I'm going to go ahead and move to the reporting section. And you can see, if I want just a simple executive summary, you can pull it up, shows you all the targets, all the hosts, what was found, basically what exploits used to get into what targets, what vulnerabilities were exploited, if any, what usernames and passwords are compromised, and you can generate reports without the password data inside it if you need to hand it off to somebody else. The detailed audit report goes into much more depth. So you have your normal host list, then you have your actual screenshots, then you have your services listings, and then you actually have your detailed console logs. So in this case, when we ran the secure shell command, it actually ran a meterpreter command line here, and this all shows up in the audit logs as well. And let's see. Other reports include your compromised host, your evidence collection, your authentication tokens. So if you want to basically get a giant list of all the shares and the passwords from the target network after you compromise, you can get it from here. And this is all pretty straightforward. If you want a more permanent report, you can generate an actual PDF report or a Word report, XML zip, all straight from here if you want to. These aren't too pretty yet, but we're still working on cleaning those up. So report generation is running in the background. When it's done, it'll show up here in the list. We can then download the report and open it up in Word. And you can see it in its not quite prettiness yet. But when we actually get to beta 3, or if not beta 3, GA, we'll have the fancy graphs and pictures and charts and all that fun stuff people expect. Also, in case you don't like what we're doing, you want to do it your own way, you can also just go through and run your own exploit. So if there's a module in Metasploit you want to run, the cool thing about the module interface here is that it doesn't take a single target host. You can actually run any given module across the entire network all at once, just with typing in the range. And it handles all automation for you. So for example, if we want to say MS08067 and then run that across the whole target network, we search for it, click on it, configure it to do the whole network. What is it, 128? I forget. Oh, yeah, good point, 234, 128. And you notice there's actually no payload option here either. There's the payload connection method, but everything else is automagic. It'll go through and figure out the firewall filters, things like that, and just pick the right port for you automatically. You can set all of your evasion options, other parameters here as well. So you'll see it'll go through and basically run, I think it does 5 hosts at a time, just running the exploit across all of them. And then as it starts getting shells, you see them showing up on the top. I think they're all at like 128 plus in the network though. Let's see. 16, 17. Yeah, so it's going through linearly right now, so it's doing .17, .16, but it'll get there. While this is running in the background, I'm going to go ahead and run to the comparison chart, and then we'll move on to the hands-on demos. So just to run through this quickly, Metasploit Framework is actually part of both products. The Metasploit Express product is composed of the Metasploit Framework, the UI, and then the automation engine. That's it. So all the communication between those two components, those 3 components, is through the XML RPC interface and a backend database. There's no magic control channel. There's no magic protocols there. You can integrate it however you want to, just as part of the product design. We're not using a forked version of Metasploit. We're using the exact same copy you can download from the web today. So when we write exploits, when we make bug fixes, when we improve payloads, that goes straight to the open source tree, and that's the tree we pull in as the Metasploit Express tree after we do QA and freezing it and so on for releases. But there's no magic anything there. It's just we're not trying to hide anything about how we do things. We just want to make it easier to use, much more effective and more efficient. The latest exploits and payloads are in both your automated network discovery piece, your scan piece, your account brute forcing, your exploit automation. You can do a lot of this by hand from the Metasploit console, but it's not automated, it's not easy, it doesn't automatically leverage information back and forth. Evidence collection, of course, you can do by hand, but we have a nice way of doing it here. Same with credential recycling. And audit logs are available through Express, but not through the free version unless you configure it in a crazy way. Target support, just about everything supports all the standard Metasploit exploits. The couple things we do have that is additional in the actual Metasploit Express part is we have the ability to go through automatic database compromise, automatic device compromise. So when we do guest passwords, we'll automatically use the password to open a session, and that's not available in the free version unless you change it together manually. We can also do lots of fun, all the workflow stuff isn't available in the free version, of course, because there's no UI. And on to the next piece, we have full-blown, full XML integration from third-party products into the product, and you can export data from Express and export reports and generate reports from Express, but not available in the free version. Your GUI, all of your out-of-box Nextpose integration, all of your graphical Nextpose configuration is in the Express version, not the free. And when you're using the Express version, you have a much more extensive XML-RPC API to automate everything that the UI can do. And of course, you get full support and community support for both products. So that's about it. The quick summary is it's pretty much full, end-to-end pen test product. It does everything from your scanning, your brute forcing, your password recycling, your exploits, your shells, your automation, your data collection. It's still just, we think we're probably 5% of where we want to be with the product in terms of overall through the life cycle of the product, where we want to go. What we're trying to do is take all the different techniques that you use during a normal pen test and expose those as options through Metasploit Express and find really neat ways to automate that. So things like your WPAT attacks, things like everything you see at Black Hat or Source or conferences like these that you want to be able to automate as a new technique, we want to add those directly to the Express product, make it push button easy to demonstrate those attacks on a real network in a real enterprise. We want to make sure it's really easy to use so people can figure out how to actually use these techniques and how to actually use these attacks. We also want to make it safe so that if you are worried about crashing a target, you can pick the most reliable and safest exploits first, and you're pretty much guaranteed that if the box is vulnerable, you're going to get a shell before it crashes. And integrated with, of course, Nextpose and Mmap, and supported by a dedicated SLA and our normal support tier process at Rapid7, which is excellent as far as I can tell. And of course, affordable so that you're not breaking the bank or losing an employee just because you decided to purchase a security tool. So any questions right now before we go back and look at the Express demo and then move on? Sorry, yes, sir?
You mentioned the public beta next week. How many people sign up for that?
Baron, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. So if you go to the Rapid7 website, directly on the homepage, there's a link to Metasploit Express. Click that, there will be a form. Fill out the form. That'll get you information for the beta program.
That's available now.
We're going to be announcing the registration. The form is available today.
So you can see we have 2 more shells from the MSO8067 exploit we ran. It's still, I think that it's actually done with that exploit. So we compromised an XP machine and a 2000 SP4 box. If we go through and close those shells through the cleanup process, which goes through and removes files and shuts down the sessions, and then go back to the session list, you can see that our sessions are still here. There's now the closed session page. If you want to reopen it, just click on the name of the exploit. It'll go through, fill all the information in for you, tell it to launch. Wait about half a second, and then go back to your sessions page and Where is it? There it is. So done, quick and easy. Thanks for your time. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we're going to move out to the hallway and do some demos. We have room for about 4 or 5 people to do live demos at a time. But we'll be here till 6 p.m. tonight minimum, and we'll be here all day tomorrow from 7 till 3 p.m. when the conference closes down. So if there's not space today, feel free to come back tomorrow. And we definitely have the beta program starting next week. So sign up if you're interested in getting your hands on that. And thanks again for your time, and appreciate it.